Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint a ladybird in acrylics. Now before I start that, I want to show here how I painted the blade of grass that it's resting on. Now this here required quite a lot of different blending techniques in order to get that nice soft shading underneath the ladybird. And I did also approach this in a slightly different way to make the ladybird easier to paint later on. Now the first thing I wanted to focus on here is the lighting. So I'm using wet on wet blending techniques and focusing on that lighter section on the right hand side, the shadow that's going to be underneath the ladybird, and then the detailing on the left side of the blade of grass. Now in order to achieve this, I like to work in multiple layers, and having a good base foundation now is going to make it much easier for replicating that realistic shadow and detailing that I'm wanting for this painting. Now in all of my tutorials, regardless if it's fur, feathers, whatever it may be, I always like to focus on a good base foundation first. I really do think this makes the entire painting process much easier. Now what I wanted to do is get something in place here that hinted at those lights and darks, and then add the outline of my ladybird in place. Now this is going to make it much easier because, as you can see here, I've already hinted at that shadow. I don't have to add the shadow in around the legs. That can be more fiddly and more time consuming. So just getting that base foundation in first has made that process much easier. Now it's also why I decided to paint this blade of grass first as well, because if I have to then paint around all of the detailing and the edges of the ladybird, if I was to paint the blade of grass after, then that is going to slow down the process. Now my aim at the moment is not to worry about the exact colour here. I'm just focusing on building up my lighter values gradually. I'm not focusing on those top highlights, those finer details yet. I'm still building those up in stages. I'm reinforcing my light source here, and again doing more of those wet on wet blending techniques. Now blending acrylics is something that I'm asked more frequently, so this is an aspect of my real-time tutorials that I cover thoroughly. Because the tutorials are recorded with a voiceover while I'm painting, I'm able to explain everything in the moment. If you are interested in any of my real-time tutorials, then I'll link all of the information to those in the description below. Now when adding the little details here under the ladybird, I do have to make sure that they're not as bright as the ones on the outer edges, because obviously that shadow shouldn't have those lighter highlights over the top. They do want to be indicated at, but you do want them to be darker and more subtle. Now in all of my paintings, I do like to work with glazes. So at this stage here, I've hinted at enough of those lighter values, and I now want to adjust the colour. So as you can see here, I'm just using a bit more of a medium to large sized filbert brush to get that colour in place fairly quickly. Now I do have a video here on YouTube where I'm talking all about glazes, demonstrating different uses for glazes with various paintings, so I'll link that video in the description below if it's of interest. But one of the biggest things to remember when working with acrylics is the layers underneath do need to be dry. If they're still wet, that glaze is going to mix in and it's going to create a real mess. Now once that glaze was dry, I can now start coming back in and again adding more of my highlights. I'm using that little filbert brush as a softening tool, and that's helping to create that slightly out of focus edging, especially on the right hand side. Now being able to capture that kind of effect with that out of focus element also, as always, relies on the blending and softening techniques. You've got many different options there. You can use a fine mist spray bottle for larger areas, which is what I used for the background. Now if you would like to see a video of how I created that soft blend, it was very simple, it only took minutes, then do let me know in the comments below and I can upload that as a separate tutorial. Now when working on the ladybird, this is where high contrast is really important. There's very rarely any occasions where I'm going to put a large area of titanium white down first, but for the white patches on the face here, it worked perfectly. That up against the darker sections on the head here, it's achieving that real sharp contrast and heightens that depth. Now when working on the subtle highlights on top, this is again another time where I'm using some softening and blending techniques. You can see here that I'm applying the paint and then I'm using another brush to blend the edges. I want to make sure that I've got those soft transitions at the edges because that's going to help build up more of that realistic shape and form, but I'm also indicating at more of the shine. Now the shine of the ladybird, as you can see in the photo of the finished painting in the corner, that's going to be exaggerated when I work on the body. But even for the top sections here on the head, the way that the lighting is catching is really important to help build up that three-dimensional shape of the face. It doesn't matter what animal it is, the lights and the darks and where they're positioned are really, really important. Now, one thing I talk about in the real-time tutorial is how to prevent or work through that feeling of being burnt out. Now, this is something that I have spoken about to lots of artists recently, and I think working on smaller projects like this is one way that can be really effective to overcome that. Now, quite often we're always looking to improve our techniques, we're always wanting to work on something that we feel is more complex to push ourselves, but always working on something like that can be one of those ways where we lose that motivation. Wanting to always create that best masterpiece potentially can be very overwhelming. Now, taking the time to work on these smaller projects like this, because this is only a 5x7 inch, it's small for the amount of detail that I'm adding here. But because I'm still aiming for a high level of realism, I still feel like I'm achieving a lot. And most importantly, I'm using all of the key fundamental techniques in this that are required for more complex paintings. So this is never time wasted. I'm always perfecting those skills that will be transferred to future, larger, more complex pieces. Now, that feeling of being burnt out is totally normal. I think it happens to every artist. But knowing how to overcome that is something that can really make a difference to the entire painting time and being at the easel. Being able to create and that time of having that relaxation away from everything else is always beneficial. And working on these smaller projects like this, I find, is one of the best ways to work through that. Now, the other reason why I love painting on smaller scales like this is because it really enables us to refine our brush technique. Where I am still aiming for a high level of realism, I'm having to have more control over that brush in order to get it to do what I want. Although I'm not painting fur or feathers, I'm having to blend, I'm having to layer, focus on my contrast. This is all something where that brush technique is so worthwhile to perfect on smaller pieces like this that we can get done in a couple of hours. Being able to then practice that and then transfer it to other pieces is just something that I really do feel is so beneficial. Now, when it came to working on the body, I have approached this in a different way. So the first thing I wanted to do is map in the darker spots. Once that paint had dried, I'm then coming in here with titanium white and painting in all of the areas that are going to be red. Now, the reason I've done this is because red is a very transparent colour. If I was to paint red directly over the green, that is not going to be as vibrant as I want and nothing like that finished painting in the corner. Being able to have that opaque layer down first, and white is perfect for this, I'm able to then layer from there and capture a good colour saturation. Now, I do have a red-eyed tree frog tutorial here on YouTube, and I use the same techniques in that to capture the vibrant greens and oranges. And the reason I needed to do that for the greens is because I had a very, very dark background. And again, if I was to put green over a dark layer, it's just not going to show up. So if that video is also of interest, I'll link that in the description below. Now, as I'm starting to work on the edge here, all I'm doing is just slightly softening the outer edge because the back of the ladybird was just a little bit out of focus. So using that additional brush here where I'm pulling some of that paint over very slightly, it's only by a couple of millimeters, but that is just helping to soften the back of that ladybird. Now, the first thing now, once that white had completely dried, I'm coming in with a red. I did just adjust the camera settings here because this red is not as accurate as it should have been. So that will shift in a moment. There you are. But then I'm coming back in here and just getting that red as vibrant as I can. Now, again, there's a lot of depth that's lacking here, so I still need to work with building up my layers. But I am hinting more at that red colour, which is perfect. Now, at times here, I come back in and I paint in the spots because I don't want to lose those, but I can also paint my red layers over the top. I don't have to work around those black spots at all. And this is because, as I've mentioned before, that red is naturally transparent, so it's not going to cover up that black. We can just almost pretend like it's not there. Now, as I continue to shade, this is where I'm really focusing on more of the blending and softening techniques. So in some cases, if you want a bit more of a smoother blend, you can add water to your canvas first, either through a fine mist spray bottle or adding water with a brush. And then you're adding your paint on top and blending it out just to get a little bit more of that smoother edge. Now, depending on how much water you apply first, you're going to end up with a very different effect. If you have too much water, you're not going to blend at all and it will work more just like an eraser. Potentially you might have water running down your canvas, which is a very clear sign that there is too much on your surface. Now, because blending acrylics is definitely one of the more trickier aspects about using the medium, this is something that I do cover thoroughly in all of my real-time step-by-step tutorials. Now, as I start building up the shine here, this is always about a layering process. The shine on the back of the Ladybird, it was not bright white highlight, so I had to build up that reflection in stages. I'm making sure to use transparent layers so that I'm not covering many layers of the red. I want to just get that almost like the lighting is curving over the top of the back. So the way that I am mixing water in my paint and how much paint I'm applying to the layer is really important. Too much paint here is going to cover up the layers underneath, which is obviously not what I want to do. Now, there's going to be many times here when I'm working with glazes. At the moment, where I'm starting to add more of my lighter reflections, this is making the red go more a bit of a pink colour. This is obviously not what I want, so once those reflections are dry, like now, I'm coming back in with another glaze to adjust the colour. Now, throughout different layering processes here, I actually incorporate a little bit of an orange colour, because in some sections of the Ladybird it wasn't bright red. So in order to capture that variation and add more of that realism, I was really paying attention to where the colour shifts from red more into an orange. Now, something I talk about in all of my tutorials here on YouTube is the importance of contrast. Now, this again is why this subject is perfect for focusing on that one aspect if that's what we're trying to improve. We can have the colours spot on, but if the contrast isn't right, so the darks aren't dark enough and the highlights aren't bright enough, that painting's not going to look as realistic and three-dimensional as it could, even if the colour is perfect. So as you can see here, I'm again adding more of my lighter layers, blending to make sure I've got that soft reflection effect correct, and then working with building up some of those highlights over the darker spots. And yet with all of these layers that I've added, I'm always blending and softening the edges to some degree. This is why this is such a good project to work on for really refining and mastering those techniques. Now, I've mentioned many times throughout this video why I love working with glazes so much, but here, where I'm coming in with another glaze to add a shadow underneath the Ladybird, it's done within a matter of seconds, yet it's added so much extra depth to the painting. And as always, at the end of a painting, spending those last couple of minutes just tweaking the contrast, adding any tiny final details, they can really make a difference. It's always worth spending that time to make sure that we don't call that painting finished too soon. So I do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to paint along to this real-time tutorial or any of my other step-by-step lessons, then I will link all of the information to that in the description below. If you've got any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.